As the autumn of 1944 unfolded, the German war effort was teetering on the edge of collapse. The Eastern Front, once the heart of the Wehrmacht's military might, was buckling under the weight of the Soviet advance. To the west, the Allies had landed in Normandy, securing a foothold in France, and were steadily pushing the Germans back. The situation was dire, and Adolf Hitler, in a desperate bid to regain the initiative, conceived a bold and risky plan, an offensive in the Ardennes, aimed at splitting the Allied forces, seizing the vital port of Antwerp, and buying precious time for Germany's flailing military industry. The offensive, known as Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein, would be launched in December, but before that a storm of logistical nightmares and strategic miscalculations were already brewing. At the center of this brewing storm was Heinz Guderian, the chief of the Army General Staff, appointed by Hitler in July 1944. A man renowned for his brilliance in the early Blitzkrieg victories, Guderian was one of the few generals in the Wehrmacht who possessed both the tactical genius and the clarity of vision to understand the fundamental flaws in Hitler's strategy. His opposition to the planned offensive in the Ardennes was not born of pessimism, but of a stark, unflinching assessment of reality. Germany could not afford to fight a war on two fronts, especially when the resources to sustain such an effort were already depleted. By the time Hitler began his preparations for the Ardennes offensive, the situation on the Eastern Front had grown untenable. The Soviet Union, having successfully repelled the German invasion, was now on the offensive, pushing back with overwhelming force. Guderian, who had witnessed firsthand the effectiveness of the Red Army's mobilization, knew that any attempt to divert vital resources to the west would leave the Eastern Front vulnerable to a Soviet winter offensive. Estimates from Reinhard Gehlen's Fremde Heere Ost, FHO, the German intelligence service focused on the Soviet Union, painted a grim picture. The Soviets were massing an army of around 6 to 7 million men, preparing for a campaign that would be devastating to the Wehrmacht. In one of the key moments of September, during a meeting at the Wolf's Lair, Hitler laid out his vision for the Ardennes offensive. He envisioned a surprise attack that would push the Allies back, capture Antwerp, and effectively split the Western Front. This was to be a bold maneuver, one that could secure victory in the West and relieve the pressure on Germany's industrial regions. However, Guderian could see that the plan was not only risky, it was fundamentally flawed. The German army, which had been worn down by years of continuous fighting, was in no position to execute such an ambitious operation. Guderian's fears were not without merit. By September 1944, Germany's fuel production had dropped dramatically. The Luftwaffe and the Allied bombers had decimated critical refineries in the Ruhr and Romania through strategic bombing campaigns. Once capable of producing around 12 million barrels of oil per month, by September, Germany's synthetic oil production had plummeted to a mere 5 to 6 million barrels. This shortfall had a profound impact on Germany's ability to sustain mechanized warfare. Panzers and trucks relied heavily on fuel, and without it, the offensive could not succeed. In addition to fuel shortages, the German army was suffering from an acute shortage of key materials. The production of tanks and artillery had stagnated, and the Wehrmacht was woefully understocked in ammunition. By late September, the OKH, Oberkommando des Heeres, had calculated that it would need approximately 1.5 to 2 million gallons of fuel every day just to keep the offensive going. But at the start of the operation, Germany's total fuel reserves were a mere 2 million gallons, enough for only 1 or 2 days of full-scale operations. This meant that the offensive, before it had even begun, was destined to run out of fuel within days, let alone achieve the sweeping victories Hitler envisioned. As the calendar turned to October, Guderian's frustration with Hitler's plans grew. He knew that the diversion of resources to the west would leave the Eastern Front exposed to the Soviet juggernaut, and in numerous briefings he raised his concerns. His analysis, informed by Gehlen's intelligence on the Soviet buildup, was unequivocal. Committing 25 divisions to the Ardennes offensive would fatally weaken Germany's defense in the east. Guderian repeatedly emphasized that the German army was already overstretched, and any further allocation of men, tanks, and crucially fuel would mean certain defeat. In October, Guderian went further, preparing detailed reports on the situation. These reports were clear. Germany's military-industrial capacity could not support a prolonged two-front war. The numbers told the story. Germany's production of tanks had decreased dramatically, with only about 1,200 operational panzers available for the Western Front, far fewer than the 2,000 needed. Ammunition production had also dropped sharply, with only about 35,000 tons of ammunition being produced each month, while the army was using more than 70,000 tons. These deficits were crippling, and Guderian knew that without significant reinforcements, the Western offensive would collapse under its own weight. Perhaps most critically, Guderian highlighted the dire state of German logistics. The train system, once a lifeline for moving troops and supplies, had been severely damaged by Allied bombing raids. By November 1944, more than 1,500 locomotives had been destroyed by Allied airstrikes, and the German rail system was unable to support the movement of troops in the numbers Hitler envisaged. Guderian's warnings about rail transport were chillingly accurate. Germany was relying on makeshift nighttime rail transport to move troops, and yet even this was severely limited by the damage done to the rail network. Guderian's objections culminated in a pivotal meeting on November 30, 1944, at Ziegenberg. During this meeting, Guderian went on the offensive against Hitler's strategy. His report, supported by Gehlen's intelligence, was blunt. The Eastern Front collapses without these reserves. Fuel for the West means no counter-offensives in the East. The reality was that the Wehrmacht could not sustain a prolonged offensive in the West without jeopardizing its defense of the East. Hitler, however, was unyielding. In his characteristic manner, he dismissed Guderian's concerns and instead promised that miracle weather would give the Germans the edge they needed. Hitler's assurances were not backed by any logical reasoning. He simply refused to acknowledge the dire state of Germany's logistical situation. Hitler's promise of a miracle weather to ensure success was a reflection of his increasingly irrational mindset. He refused to accept the simple truth that Germany's war economy was crumbling and that the country could not sustain a military offensive of such scale. Guderian, in his memoirs Panzer Leader, would later describe this period as one of strategic blindness. While Hitler clung to his vision of a repeat of the 1940 French campaign, Guderian understood that the situation was far different. The Luftwaffe had been decimated by the Allied bombing campaign, and the German army was scattered and weary, unable to muster the strength necessary for another large-scale offensive. Guderian's objections were rooted in a cold, hard understanding of logistics and military strategy. He knew that fuel was the lifeblood of modern warfare. Without it, tanks and trucks would be immobilized, and the offensive would grind to a halt before it even had a chance to begin. But Hitler, blinded by his own delusions of grandeur, ignored the warnings and pressed forward with his plans. The consequences of this decision would soon become painfully apparent. By the time the German offensive, Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein, was grinding to a halt in the dense forests of the Ardennes, the initial excitement and hopes for a breakthrough had evaporated into a grim realization of the operation's failure. The spearhead of the attack, led by Sepp Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army, had made initial gains, but by December 19, 1944, the assault was already bogged down near the town of Bastogne. A combination of fierce resistance from American forces, logistical issues, and weather conditions had effectively stalled the advance. In the midst of the chaos, however, a significant moment arrived, one that would dramatically shift the perspective of the German military high command. As German forces pushed forward, they captured vital American supplies and intelligence, including the US V Corps logistics charts near Malmedy on December 17th and Stavelot on December 18th. These documents would prove to be a devastating blow to the already fragile German morale, confirming what Heinz Guderian had been warning all along. The Germans simply could not match the scale and efficiency of Allied logistics. The discovery of these charts would not only change the course of the offensive, but also provide an insight into the asymmetric war that the Germans were fighting. The Battle of the Bulge was not just a conflict of armies on the battlefield, it was also a struggle of logistics. For the Germans, the scarcity of fuel, ammunition, and transport had already made the offensive unsustainable, but the capture of US V Corps supply maps revealed the full extent of the imbalance between the Allies and the Germans. On December 17th, Joachim Peiper's Kampfgruppe, part of the 6th Panzer Army, seized American maps that outlined detailed logistics information for the V Corps. These maps revealed that a single U.S. corps consumed between 400,000 and 500,000 gallons of fuel per day, roughly equivalent to the monthly fuel needs of an entire German army group. The logistics charts were more than just figures. They were a stark confirmation of the magnitude of the logistical gap between the Allies and the Germans. The U.S. Army, buoyed by Lend-Lease and the massive resources of American industry, had a seemingly endless supply of fuel and trucks. The Red Ball Express, a network of truck convoys, delivered more than 12,000 tons of supplies per day, ensuring that the Allies were able to keep their forces moving and well supplied. This level of logistical efficiency was something Germany could never hope to match, given their depleted reserves and bombed-out infrastructure. In addition to the fuel figures, the captured charts also detailed the amount of ammunition needed to sustain U.S. operations. The Allies were expending ammunition at a rate that outstripped German production by a factor of 3. For example, U.S. artillery fired at a rate of 3 rounds for every 1 round fired by the Germans. This created an overwhelming advantage in firepower that the Germans could not counter. German units, especially those in the panzer divisions, found themselves without the necessary ammunition to sustain their assaults, further undermining the offensive. When the captured U.S. supply charts were delivered to the German High Command, the reaction was immediate and profound. Senior German officers were shocked by what they saw. One of the first to review the charts was Guderian, who had already been warning about the fuel and supply shortages facing the offensive. In his memoirs, Panzer leader Guderian described the moment as a turning point, where the scale of the U.S. logistical advantage became undeniable. The captured charts revealed an uncomfortable truth. Not only were the Allies able to sustain their operations with a level of efficiency and resources that the Germans simply couldn't match, but the Allies also had the capacity to replenish their supplies at a rate that was inconceivable for the Germans. German officers, who had hoped for a quick and decisive breakthrough, now saw the grim reality that even if they could secure some of the Allied fuel depots, they would be unable to sustain their operations in the long term. The captured charts exposed the fragility of the German position, highlighting the vulnerability of their logistics and the unsustainable nature of the offensive. One of the most telling reactions came from a U.S. colonel who was captured during the fighting. When interrogated, the officer reportedly quipped, "Now you know why you'll lose." This remark, delivered with a mixture of bitterness and fatalism, encapsulated the sense of despair that was beginning to set in among the German ranks. For many of the officers who had spent months preparing for the offensive, the captured charts represented an incontrovertible piece of evidence that the Germans were fighting a losing battle. A battle that they could not win with the limited resources at their disposal. While Guderian and other officers were grappling with the new reality revealed by the captured charts, Hitler remained insistent that the offensive could still succeed. This was typical of Hitler's mindset during the war, a refusal to confront the harsh realities on the ground in favor of pursuing his own delusional visions of victory. Despite the overwhelming evidence that the offensive was failing, Hitler continued to place his faith in what he called miracle weather, and the hope that a last-minute shift in fortune could still turn the tide. On December 19th, the day after the charts were reviewed, the OKW issued a memo that would become infamous in German military circles. One American division consumes more gasoline daily than an entire German corps. This disparity ensures indefinite sustainment. The memo, written by the logistics section under Guderian's supervision, laid bare the magnitude of the problem. German officers, stunned by the figures, began to whisper of defeatism, acknowledging the dire situation for the first time. For many, the realization that the Germans were outmatched not just in terms of manpower, but in logistics as well, was a sobering moment. Guderian, in particular, recognized that the offensive could not continue much longer, and the focus shifted from an optimistic breakthrough to a grim fight for survival. By December 20th, as Piper's tanks idled at less than 10% capacity, it was clear that the Germans had lost the initiative. Fuel shortages forced German units to abandon hundreds of tanks, and the logistical bottlenecks caused delays in troop movements. The fighting continued, But the Germans were now operating at a severe disadvantage. The panzer divisions, once the spearhead of blitzkrieg tactics, were now immobilized by their lack of fuel and ammunition. The shock of the captured Charts, combined with the growing realization that the Germans could not sustain the offensive, led to a shift in the mindset of many officers. The optimism of the early days of the offensive began to give way to a creeping sense of panic. The American response to the fuel crisis was equally remarkable. Despite losing millions of gallons of fuel in the initial fighting, the Allies were able to replenish their stocks almost immediately, thanks to their superior logistics network. German officers, now acutely aware of the Allies' logistical superiority, could only watch as the US forces continued to resupply their troops with almost unmatchable efficiency. As the Germans struggled to make progress, Guderian delivered a final blow to Hitler's delusions. On December 22, 1944, in a Führer conference at Ziegenberg, Guderian finally told Hitler that the offensive was doomed. Presenting the captured Charts as evidence, he declared, "The end is near, face it." Guderian, with his characteristic directness, warned that the shortages of fuel and ammunition had doomed the operation, and there was no longer any hope of achieving the original objectives. Despite his clear and reasoned argument, Hitler, as usual, rejected the truth. In a tirade, he accused Guderian and others of being traitors and pessimists, refusing to face the reality that the offensive had already failed. The collapse of the offensive in the days that followed was not only a military disaster, but a psychological one. Guderian's warnings had proven prophetic, and the captured US logistics charts had exposed the fatal flaw in Hitler's strategy. The Germans were simply unable to compete with the scale of American logistical capabilities, and by the end of December, the offensive was effectively over. The Battle of the Bulge had begun with grand hopes of a decisive German victory, but it ended in defeat, largely due to the unsustainable nature of Germany's logistical situation, a situation that the captured Charts had made abundantly clear. By December 22, 1944, the Battle of the Bulge had begun to unravel. What started as Adolf Hitler's last-ditch attempt to break the Western Front and seize the initiative was collapsing under the weight of insurmountable logistical challenges. The capture of US fuel charts by German forces had already exposed the disparity in resource allocation between the Allies and the Germans. Even as German tanks idled due to a lack of fuel, artillery fire dwindled because of dwindling ammunition stocks, and rail lines were congested and ineffective. It was clear to many in the German High Command, including Heinz Guderian, that the offensive was doomed. However, it was not until the key Führer conference at Ziegenberg on December 22 that Guderian made his final explicit declaration to Hitler that the operation was finished. Despite the mounting evidence that the offensive had failed, Hitler, obsessed with his vision of a miraculous breakthrough, refused to acknowledge the harsh truth. It was during this conference that Guderian's frustration reached its peak, and he made his most direct challenge to Hitler's unwavering optimism. On December 22, 1944, as the German offensive in the Ardennes stalled due to fuel and ammunition shortages, Guderian arrived at Ziegenberg for a critical meeting with Hitler and other senior leaders. Guderian had already seen the grim reports from the front, including the dire logistics situation. The 6th Panzer Army, which had been the spearhead of the offensive, had advanced no more than 30 miles into the enemy lines, only to grind to a halt near Bastogne. The massive fuel and supply shortages, exacerbated by the relentless Allied bombardment of German supply routes, had crippled the offensive. At the Ziegenberg meeting, Guderian, accompanied by the captured US logistics charts, made his position clear. He presented the evidence to Hitler and his inner circle, explaining that the logistical shortages of fuel and ammunition had rendered the offensive unsustainable. He declared, "The end is near, face it." The message was simple. The Germans could no longer sustain the offensive, and unless drastic changes were made, it would collapse in failure. The reaction from Hitler was predictably furious. Hitler, in his typical manner, responded with a tirade, accusing Guderian and others of treason and labeling them as pessimists. To Hitler, the captured charts and the reports of fuel shortages did not represent an unavoidable reality. They were simply a challenge to be overcome by miracle weather and other improbable factors. Hitler's refusal to accept the logistical realities and the growing recognition among his generals that the offensive was doomed was a hallmark of his increasingly detached leadership. Despite the barrage of verbal abuse from Hitler, Guderian stood his ground. Drawing attention to the captured US charts, he reiterated the fatal logistical imbalance that had crippled the offensive from the outset. "Fuel and ammunition shortages doom the offensive," Guderian said. "Their divisions refuel in hours, ours idle for days." Guderian's words were a direct, pragmatic assessment of the dire situation. The Germans were simply outmatched, not only in terms of manpower, but in the critical resources that sustained modern warfare. Guderian's frustration was not only with the immediate failure of the offensive, but with the broader strategic miscalculation that had led to it. By diverting resources away from the Eastern Front and committing them to an ill-conceived offensive in the West, Hitler had left Germany's defenses exposed. The Soviet forces were poised for a major winter offensive, and without the necessary reinforcements or resources, the German army was in no position to hold the line. Guderian's warnings, however, were ignored. Hitler, steadfast in his belief in a miraculous reversal of fortune, refused to consider any alternative plan. Guderian's persistence at the Ziegenberg Conference, in the face of such hostility, marks one of the final moments of direct confrontation between him and Hitler. In his memoirs, Panzer Leader, Guderian recounted the events with a sense of disbelief. Hitler's refusal to acknowledge reality led to a strategic paralysis within the Wehrmacht. His blind belief in the miracle concept meant that we were fighting a war we could no longer win. As the days passed and the situation on the ground continued to deteriorate, Guderian's view became increasingly bleak. By January 10, 1945, after the offensive had effectively failed and the Soviets launched their Vistula-Oder offensive, Guderian knew that Germany's military position was hopeless. The loss of the Ardennes offensive had stripped Germany of its last significant strategic option on the Western Front, while the Soviet advance threatened the very heart of Germany. In a desperate memo to Hitler, Guderian made a bold proposal. "The war cannot be won militarily. Resources are exhausted. The only course of action left is independent negotiations through neutral countries like Sweden or Switzerland." Guderian, ever the realist, understood that Germany's industrial capacity had been irreparably damaged and that there was no longer any chance of a military victory. Hitler, however, rejected this suggestion outright. He clung to his dream of wonder weapons and a miraculous victory, refusing to consider any form of negotiation. The idea of peace talks was anathema to Hitler's worldview, and he regarded Guderian's memo as yet another example of defeatism. Guderian's proposal to seek peace through neutral intermediaries was anathema to Hitler's ideological commitment to total war. At this point, Guderian's influence within the German High Command had already begun to wane. His warnings about the unsustainable nature of the German war effort were becoming increasingly apparent, but they were ignored by Hitler and his inner circle. By March 1945, as the Soviet forces approached Berlin, the inevitable collapse of the Third Reich was all but assured. Guderian's position, both within the military and with Hitler, had deteriorated. On March 28, 1945, after the failed attempt to retake the Kustrin bridgehead, Guderian was dismissed from his post as Chief of the Army General Staff. Hitler, in a fit of rage, accused Guderian of infecting the staff with pessimism and blamed him for the failure to achieve success in the Ardennes. Guderian's response was a final, defiant statement: "I've shown you the charts, now show me the miracles." This exchange marked the end of Guderian's direct involvement in the German war effort. Replaced by Hans Krebs, Guderian withdrew from active military duty and retreated to Pomerania. He would later testify at the Nuremberg trials, where he would lay the blame for Germany's defeat squarely at Hitler's feet. Guderian argued that the failure of the war was not a result of tactical errors or a lack of courage among the soldiers, but rather a consequence of Hitler's refusal to accept the realities of logistics, industry, and resources. The collapse of the Ardennes offensive and the subsequent dismissal of Guderian were pivotal moments in the final months of World War II. Guderian's warnings about the logistical limitations of Germany's war economy The imbalance in fuel and ammunition and the dangers of fighting on two fronts proved to be prescient. His final confrontation with Hitler at the Ziegenberg Conference, in which he presented irrefutable evidence of the offensive's failure, marked the moment when the gap between reality and Hitler's delusions became too wide to bridge. In the aftermath, as Germany spiraled toward its ultimate defeat in May 1945, Guderian's analysis of the war's true causes gained greater recognition. The declassified documents, including the captured US logistics charts, provided a damning assessment of Germany's inability to compete with Allied industrial power. Modern historians and military analysts credit Guderian's foresight and pragmatism for exposing the flaws in Germany's strategy and contributing to the eventual collapse of the Third Reich. In the years following the war, Guderian's memoir Panzer Leader would become a key text for understanding the strategic mistakes of Nazi Germany, as well as the pivotal role that logistics and resource management played in the outcome of the conflict. The charts, once captured in the heat of battle, would later serve as a powerful symbol of the industrial superiority of the Allies and a reminder of the critical role that logistics played in shaping the course of modern warfare.